Welcome to Salvage, a podcast for conversations with artists about the repurposed materials they use in their art practice. Hey there. Welcome to my conversation with Ian Trask. Ian is a sculptor and a multimedia artist who transforms waste materials into objects and installations with new purpose and integrity. His immersive works often play with sophisticated patterns, lending unlikely materials exquisite beauty. At other times, he works on an intimate scale with puckish humor. Thank you for being here, Ian. I'm delightful to have made your acquaintance because we were together in the Plastic Culture Show. So I knew about your work beforehand, and I can't tell you how many people have sent me images of your work before and after we met.
That's great. It was great to meet you at the opening.
Yeah. But after that, it's so funny because I don't remember how many years ago I discovered your work. And of course, I was obviously attracted to it because of my own work. And then after I knew about it, I would get, people would send me pictures and be like, yes, yes, I can't wait to one day meet this guy. And now I'm like, oh, I know that guy.
Kind of fun when it works that way, doesn't it?
It is. So, but if you don't mind, I want to start at the very beginning. Were you an artist as a kid?
Uh, yes, I was. I really loved art as a kid. I just, like the yearbook superlative section for eighth grade. I got most artistic, and then in high school, I ended up going to like a prep school, so like an all-guy Jesuit prep school that
Oh,
focused more on, I guess, conventional academics, and it
mhm.
didn't really have an art program. So my only really option to take art in high school was to do it as like a after school club.
Okay.
So it kind of stayed present. And then while I was at college, at Bowdoin College in Maine, which is a liberal arts school, my studies were mostly in science.
Ah,
It's really hard to fit in art labs or in art classes because you had all these other blocks of time that were dominated by science labs. So I ended up getting a little bit of drawing and a little bit of photography, but like that's almost the extent of my art education.
that's cool.
I got to art kind of through my own path, I guess.
No, that's important. And what kind of science did you study?
Like a lot of ecology and marine biology,
Ah,
some genetics and cell biology.
oh,
Um,
that's
and
cool and interesting stuff.
yeah, and like I studied abroad in Copenhagen and I took a lot of marine biology classes there about like marine mammals and yeah, it's
Oh,
cool to have that as a baseline.
yeah, that's so cool. And you got to travel too.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that's amazing. And so drawing and a little bit of painting, that kind of stuff. And how did you have a career in science after you went to school?
Very much so. So after graduating, I moved to Boston and I got a job in a genetics lab
Ooh.
called the Channing Lab, which is affiliated with the Brigham and Women's Hospital. And they were studying respiratory diseases. So I
Mm.
was there for about a year. And then one of my good friends from school was living in Salt Lake City. And he was like, you should come move out here and live with me. And like, we can snowboard and rock climb. And so I moved out there, kind of pursuing fun, I guess, and got
Uh-huh.
in another science lab. This time, the University of Utah, it was another genetics lab.
Mm.
And this one was studying sort of what signals our muscle tissue to grow into the shapes, into
Oh,
the essentially muscle tissue. So we used like a mouse model. I took care of like my job was to manage the interbreeding of like 300 plus lab
oh
mice,
my gosh.
keep track of all that. Yeah, so like that was the first 2 years out of school, and that's really where I thought my life was going.
Uh-huh.
But I kind of had this hobby that I picked up in my last 2 years at Bowdoin, bending forks into little sculptures.
Oh, okay. I did see that on your website. Okay. That's
Yeah,
how it started.
that
Okay.
was like my first sort of foray into like exploring a single material with
Uh-huh.
with some intensity. And after school, after Bowdoin, where I no longer had my free source of forks from the dining hall. I would buy them from Goodwill stores for years, and that kind of is something that just kind of maintained in the background long enough for me to develop a habit and get some positive feedback from people around me. And that was kind of I guess one of the kernels of me becoming an artist.
Okay.
There was a lot of things that kind of coalesced. I had a
Yeah.
few opportunities along the way too. Not right after graduation, maybe a year later, to work with an artist who would bring a bunch of art kids to a field in Tennessee for the Bonnaroo Music Festival.
Oh, cool.
And then he would divide them up into little groups and they would make interactive sculptures in the campgrounds. And I did that for 3 Bonnaroo festivals, so 2006, 7, and 8. So that was kind of happening concurrently while I was in the lab. And these were just these like formative experiences for me where I would go and have nothing to do all day but make art. And that was my first time being so fully immersed
Hmm.
in art making.
And what kind of sculptures did you make with these kids?
So my group specifically, we used yarn. So we kind of would put these grids of steel fence posts into the grass and then just supply as much yarn as we could budget and just let people kind of do what they wanted. And
Oh,
we would kind of tidy it up and shape it kind of in between sort of the tenders of the garden, I guess. But it was very chaotic. It was a good lesson in not being too attached to what you make. Because you go to lunch and come back and everything you had done was like obliterated by
oh no.
yeah. Yeah, so I guess and that was sort of also an early lesson there was that like the first year we used all this yarn and then we stored it in these trash bags and we came the next year we pulled all that yarn out to reuse it again and it's like it's much harder to use when it's a tangled mess
Mm.
when it's sort of tidy in those skeins or bundles. So there was a degree of figuring out what to do with the mess, which in some ways is part of what we both do now.
Yes, you could call it that.
Yeah. So I
Uh,
guess from there, if you want to kind of know the journey, I was very lucky to have a boss at the time in Utah who was very encouraging when I told her that I was considering leaving the science field and pursuing art. I
oh,
was,
wow. That's unusual.
yeah, I would have expected maybe a little more, I guess, resistance, but I think she just had a really good perspective on it. I think she met her husband in graduate school, and he eventually turned more towards a creative path. And she's like, I've just encountered so many people in her field, my field at the time, that had sort of committed so far down sort of an education path and research
Mhm.
path that like it's almost impossible to turn around. But they
Yeah,
weren't but they weren't happy doing it. She's like,
yeah,
if you see now that like this might not be the right thing for you, like by all means go and pursue this other thing that's like drawing your attention.
right. Now, if you had stayed in that field, would you have had to further your education there? Like go for a master's or something or a PhD?
I'm sure I would have pursued a master's or PhD at that point. I think I was just like realizing that like if I were going to go down that path, this art making, this creative thing that was really just hitting all the marks in my head, and I was enjoying it so much, like I would have had to push that aside, and it really would have become like full on focus on some sort of field of study.
Right.
And instead, like I would 5 o'clock would hit, and rather than like staying in the lab and maybe looking at slides of the stuff we prepared that day, I would run home and be making things in the garage in Utah
Right.
because that's what I wanted to do.
Oh, that's great. Wow. So how did you make that leap? Did you quit your job and just decided to try to start out as an artist, or did little things sort of start happening?
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a bit of a slow process because it's like
Mhm.
I didn't really know how that worked, right? I didn't really have the formal training to do it. I didn't really have a network. I think where it started first was sort of a mental decision of just, okay, if what I want to do is to be an artist and I want to make things, like, how about anytime I have this idea, creative impulse, I make it happen, So
Mhm.
focus on completing ideas and making things and kind of moving on to new ideas and like let that just be this foundational habit. So that
Mhm.
was started with that, and then I decided that Salt Lake City wasn't really the right place to kind of to make that jump into the art world. It just seemed like there wasn't a fertile enough ground. So I was like, I've got some friends in New York City. How about I try to go move to New York? And that's when this other key moment happened where I needed to raise some money to pay rent, obviously. So I went back home to Massachusetts, where I grew up, to work for a few months to make some money. And
Mhm.
that job that I got was actually as a groundskeeper at a hospital. So my dad was
Oh,
a hospital administrator for years. So he worked at Harrington Hospital in Southbridge, Mass. And at a previous summer in my life, I worked there as just kind of like a worked with the grounds crew, just kind of helping them do what they need to do, like shuttle boxes around mostly. This time I got this job as a groundskeeper,
mhm.
and really it was picking up garbage in parking lots, like was
Ah,
the job. So you can kind of picture
somebody's got to do it.
he's got to do it, and you can kind of picture my mental state at the moment being like, I have this expensive degree from Bowdoin College in science. I've got like my name on a published paper. I've got like I've got like a fully fleshed out resume in science. And now I'm quitting that to become an artist, which I don't even know what that means. And I'm picking up trash every day and just kind of like, what the hell am I doing? Kind
Yeah.
of. But and there was a lot of like frustration built into that, obviously. The fresh landscape of litter every
Hmm.
day was sort of aggravating. And it kind of just like it lit a bit of a fire in me. Like here's this thing I can be sort of I don't know. Anger in that sense is kind of a motivating force, right? I don't know if anger was the right choice, but it was kind of like it gave me this thing that I could focus on, and it was. Um, I think it also became apparent that it was just an infinite amount of material out there that I. So here is just something that wouldn't cost me any money, which was important for me at the time because really I wasn't planning to go to art school. I wasn't really planning on like pursuing it conventionally. So I needed to find a way that I could make it work that was going to be cost effective. And it was, I think I was originally drawn to research for this positive benefit it has on society. So kind of finding a way to channel some of that, I guess, optimism, or just like,
Okay.
yeah, a little bit of how can I improve the world around me? And I think channeling my sort of appreciation for the environment and kind of my understanding of humans as sort of part of this greater ecology, all that mixed up together with like,
Right. I love that. So did you, during that job, start making something with the trash that you were finding?
I did. I would bring things and I'd be like making weird mobiles in my parents' basement. I don't think any of those actually survived, but yeah, I was definitely doing some weird stuff with it.
So curious, what kind of, so this would, what year would this have been around?
That would have been 2007.
And what kind of trash were you finding in the parking lot in 2007?
Um, Keyboards, bicycle parts.
Ah.
I got these like really great like electrical cords that were like at least like an inch plus thick that just had all
Oh,
these like brown sort of insulating papers twisted up with all these other like kind of like bundles of wires inside of it, which
huh.
I took those and I still have some in my studio and I still use some of them today.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. But a lot of like weird a lot of like metal and stuff like that.
Interesting. So not plastic though.
Not yet, not
Yeah.
specific. I mean, I guess the keyboards had plastic in them,
Right, but like they're not plastic bottles and bottle caps and things like that, which is what you find now.
right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, interesting. Huh. So, so after that gig, you moved to New York and started pursuing your art career in earnest.
Correct. Yeah, it was probably a good. So that was early 2008, or like I guess end of 2007, 2008
Mhm.
to New York. It took me a little bit of time to find like a good job. I worked as a temp at like a jewelry designer, which was kind of a pretty awful job. But then I ended up getting really lucky and getting hired at like it was an art gallery that had its own frame shop.
Oh.
So it was this French gallery owner who had his home base in like Atlantic Ave in Brooklyn,
Hmm.
had like galleries in Chelsea and San Francisco and New Orleans and Boston. And a lot of his like artists were French or European. And like he would ship all their paintings on rolls to Brooklyn and we would, stretch them and frame them.
Oh.
So I got this job first as the shipper for that company. Um, and then one of the framers they had on hand was just doing a bad job. So they ended up training me to be a framer. So I worked as a framer for 4 years for this
Oh,
company,
wow.
which was pretty cool. It was actually a great way to get a new stream of material and to have a shop at my disposal, which I think
Oh,
was at that moment because I didn't really have a studio. I was
right.
just
Oh, so they let you do stuff in their shop? Oh,
yep.
that's so cool.
He was also great. He owned like a retail space across the street too. That was a doctor's office, but when the doctor's office moved out, he would let me like work in these empty rooms across the street. I've been very lucky at having like
That's so great.
landlords or bosses that let me use random basements or empty spaces. I've been fortunate in that sense.
That's very cool. Wow. So what kind of things were you making and from what at that time?
Uh, well, I think I've always sort of had like numerous paths to the way I work. I've even since as early as those times, I was doing like larger scale installation work, and I was doing most of that with cardboard. Um,
Yeah, I saw that. That looked really cool. Now, was this cardboard you were getting from the shop?
some from the shop, and if I needed more, I would just walk down the sidewalk.
Right.
Hope I got there before the dogs did. But yeah, that was kind of my favorite material for a long while, and it was nice in that like because I didn't really have permanent spaces. If I showed something and then I didn't have room for it, you can kind of put it back in the system
Right.
rather easily. So there's a lot of cardboard at that time, but I was also just like building frames with scrap molding. So I would use a lot of like wood molding from the frame shop. I'd use a lot of plexiglass and foam core and just
Oh,
like
cool.
build frames as sort of vessels to
Uh-huh.
hold materials I was coming across. It was kind of around that time that I started using thermoform plastic packaging. You know,
Ah,
you would like order a shop tool and you'd have this little, it was almost like the plexi to your frame was this cool shaped thing. And I would like
right.
fill stuff behind it and make these little one-off pieces.
Ah, that's what those are. Okay.
And then eventually, because I was doing that, people would save those and give them to me, which I'm sure we'll get into. It turned into a whole body of work down the road because I just had acquired this collection of.
Yeah. So where did you keep that collection?
Uh, I mean, it really it evolved. There's a period where I was just working in my apartment, and then my landlord let me work in his garage. And then I just got really lucky in 2009. So I worked for about a year before I really gained any traction and had an
Mhm.
opportunity to show my work. But in 2009, I almost got into three shows all at the same time.
Oh,
Um,
cool.
one was uh, an outdoor art show in Dumbo, the Art at the Bridge Festival. So I did a big cardboard installation there. And then one of the shows I got into was by this new art group called Recession Arts. They were they had like a bunch of pop up shows. They didn't really have a home base, but they
Uh-huh.
rented the top floor of a new art center called the Invisible Dog,
I've
which
heard of it. I've never been, but they're still around, right? The Invisible Dog?
they're still around, but they're on their final year in that building. So
Oh.
they're kind of evolving their program. And I think
Oh, okay.
they're going to do sort of guest art direction in different places until they
Oh, okay.
step
Gotcha.
down. But yeah, so I was in a show in this building where the Invisible Dog had its new art center. And like, I at that time it was still it was underdeveloped. So it was an old textile factory at one point. They made like belts and suspenders and
Hmm.
the invisible dog toy, which is that like gimmicky toy that was popular in the 70s that looks like a dog leash with no dog in it. Like a,
Oh, is that where the name came from? I had no idea.
yep. And like someone had made a bench in the gallery out of these stacked spools of colorful elastic belts. And,
Mm.
you know, I was talking to the people behind Recession Art, and they're like, if you go through that door there, there's like thousands of them. And I just like went through the door, and it was like the half of the building that was underdeveloped. The windows are busted out. There's like pigeons living in these like
Oh.
stacked pools. But I was like, here's this. This is what I'm doing. Is like I'm looking for interesting materials in the world around me,
Mhm.
and here's this like treasure trove. So,
Right. It was just presented to you.
and I approached Lucien Zion, who's the director, and it kind of was like, "What are you doing with all that material?" You know, and he's like, "Well, I'm willing to give it away to artists for free. You know, if they give something back." And that just turned into this like incredibly magical relationship for me, where he gave me a key to the building, and then he just let me use just like anything I wanted in the basement. So the basement was just like absolutely stuffed with stuff that was sort of cleared out of upper floors and just kind of stashed in this basement. And I cobbled together a desk out of like all these random things and just started making down there. Like, and I was down there for about 3 months in the winter of 2009. And then as he started to develop the building and build in studios, he let me have a studio for free for like another
Oh,
six
wow.
months. And it was this just like, it was just perfect for me because all of a sudden I had a community of artists around me of all different abilities and just
Mhm.
make such amazing work. And it was just like that became my art school in a way. It was just having access to these people, not just at shows, but just socially in between moments and just like
Yeah.
and stuff.
Oh,
And
that's amazing. So is that where you made that, I guess, a hot house out of old windows and doors?
so actually, I didn't make that building. Um, an artist in the building, Anne Morier. She's a French artist. Her husband was actually the owner of the building and had sort of a construction crew that worked out of the basement that actually serviced other nearby apartments that he owned as well. And she had a project to, I don't know, she commissioned them to build that glass
Oh.
for a show of her own, but then she continued to show other artists in it.
Oh, that's cool. Well, that was perfect for your exhibit.
Yeah, it worked out really nice
Yeah,
actually.
tell me what you hung in there.
So I one way that I deal with the random materials that I acquire is to bind them up into these little orbs, and it's just kind of become like an easy way for me to consume and trap things,
Ah.
thinking about it too hard. Because like I'll take one step back and be like, in the beginning, it was what materials I could find personally, and that's how that was my gateway into sort of trash as a medium. But I'm sure you're familiar with this that other people witness that and then are sort of eager to participate and share and give you things. And like I've really tried to open my door to that interaction and just be very accepting of as many materials as I can. But like
Mhm.
not all those materials are, I guess, aesthetically interesting. So there are ways for me to like just chew up those things and put them into a material, like put them into a visual form. And
Yeah.
that's like I use string mostly, and I bind up these random materials into these balls, and then I found that as those balls accumulated, I was like the potential for what I can do with them.
Right. Oh, I love that. Yeah, because I get a lot of unsolicited materials myself. And then sometimes I use it, and other times some things in there that I'm like, I don't know what to do with this. But
Mm-hmm.
that's a good idea. Maybe I'll be making some balls now too.
It was, and then there was a certain point where I had a residency. I was at a residency at Mass MoCA has this
Oh, how cool.
video program,
Yeah.
and that was the first time I tried suspending them.
Uh-huh.
Before they were always just like heavy clumps on the ground. And I generally try to make them out of like singular materials, so like all the same object, but that really just changed over time. And then I tried suspending them, and all of a sudden these like sort of small, inconsequential ones just had this presence in space.
Yeah.
They could spin and kind of shake and vibrate, and it just kind of like it really made them come alive. And so that glass house structure, the one you mentioned before, out of like old windows and doors, I suspended, I don't know, maybe like 250 of them
Oh, wow.
in this volume, and I called it Waste of Space, kind of being like, we like to think about interplanetary travel and like colonizing new planets. And I'm like, what's the point if we don't even know how to like treat our current home with
Mm.
the fact that we can stay living on it? So like this idea of like, human as this parasitic invader laying waste to the space around us. But there is also kind of a pun in that like that glass house structure was actually built in an empty lot that probably some developer could have turned into a
Yeah.
project, and this little glass house art space was technically a waste of space from that sort of financial side.
Yeah. You could go to so many different ways there. Is that glass house still exists? Do you know?
I think they had to take it down. I think
Oh,
they
bummer.
were very permanent on it, and then they were almost like would have had to pay too much to keep it there.
Mm, that's too bad. It's
Yeah.
very cool looking, but I'm glad you got a chance to exhibit in it.
And
Very cool. Wow. And so the image that other people share with me, most of your work is your little hot house all out of plastic containers,
mhm.
which is there only one version of it, or are there more than one versions of it?
There are so the one that was, are you talking about the one that was in the SVA show?
Yes, that one.
That one was like like a backyard scale greenhouse frame that was clad in stitched together clear plastic packaging.
Right.
That's like that's a later development. That project started in 2015, 2014, 2015, when the Invisible Dog gave me, like, Lucien was like, I want to give you a solo show, make something big. And I pitched something, and he was like, no, try harder. Like, I want you to like really be out of your element on this one. And that's where I was in my studio, just kind of like looking around at what I had. And for me, like big installation work the question kind of starts with access to a material, right?
Mhm.
It's not just like I have this vision and I'm going to execute it, and no matter what, I'm going to get there. It's almost like, do I, can I find enough of this thing to make my goal, right? So it's like you're kind of thinking through access to material at the same time as you're thinking about the final object, right? Like,
So they both inform each other.
sure, like if I can't get enough of it between now and the opening, right? Like I'm not gonna make something that's 3 times as big as that, because like that just doesn't work. So I was kind of like looking around at what I had in my studio, trying to extrapolate on what materials are out there, what can I really ask my community to help me source.
Mhm.
And I just had this box of maybe 50 of those packages. And in my head, I'm like, I know there's just millions of those there. Can I get enough of them in the 6 months, 7 months I have between saying yes to taking the opportunity to the actual deadline?
Mhm.
Um, and then from there, I was like, I think I can. So now I started with kind of a demo. So maybe just like a little patch of it.
Mhm.
Um, and also thinking about attachments. I didn't really want it to be glued.
Okay.
I knew that I
That
didn't want,
probably wouldn't last.
yeah, like I end up kind of abusing it as I move it around. And
Uh-huh.
like in my head, the nightmare was just like, when I'm installing this, it's going to be like cracking and falling apart. And it's going to
Right.
be just a terrifying nightmare. So I was like, I need something that's a little more pliable. And I also had some internet wire in my studio. So I stripped the internet wire and
Mhm.
used little plastic coated copper wires and used that as kind of a thread
Ah.
by poking holes in the plastic in each package to kind of overlay with one another, and then stitching it together.
So they're like little twist ties.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh.
So that project, that was the hardest thing I think I've ever done. Just because the timeline was so tight
Hmm.
and the scale of what I wanted to build was pretty massive.
It looks massive. Now, was this in the Invisible Dog space?
Yeah,
And it looks like it's 20 feet tall or something like that.
it's like 14 feet tall.
Okay. Wow.
And 14 feet tall, so floor to ceiling. Like I wanted it to stretch entirely from the floor to the ceiling.
Mhm.
There's four walls that are 16 feet.
Wow.
So, and then it was hollow in the middle with two doorways.
Uh,
Um, and that took, like, that was really hard. It was like, okay, like I have this much time to collect thousands of packages. I have to figure out how to like talk to people, narrow in on a language to convince people that this is what I'm looking for. You
yeah.
know, that was a project in itself, kind of
Mhm.
figure talk about what I'm doing and convincing people to bring it somewhere. And then like at the time my studio was maybe 10 feet by 10 feet. So how are you going to store and make something?
Yeah.
Um, so I was like panicking about where it's going to happen. Yeah, I ended up doing a Kickstarter to raise some money because I had to
Play.
quit my job to focus full time on this thing.
Oh
I,
my God.
I got
Paper
ACL
face.
in there too.
You got a what?
I got ACL surgery in that period as well.
Oh
But actually, I got a residency at Pioneer Works in Red Hook. Do you know them?
no. No, I don't.
Um, it's this really cool residency program in like an art center in like an old ship building down by the water in Red Hook, run by
Oh,
art.
cool. Oh, I yes. Is that the Brooklyn Artist Coalition? Is that there? Is that what I'm thinking about?
It's nearby. It's
Okay.
like
In the same neighborhood, kind of.
in the
Okay.
same neighborhood. They focus a lot on sort of like art and science together.
Mhm.
But yeah, I had a 4 month residency there, which was just like a godsend. Had a big enough footprint where I could like lay out an entire wall on the ground.
Yeah, because you kind of got it that you have all these different patterns of those clamshell containers or egg egg cartons and stuff like that, and you got to figure out what you have to make patterns. So there's
Mhm.
something so quilt-like about the patterns that you made.
It was very quilt-like, and you almost had to. It was tricky too because it's like if you commit to a pattern too soon before you know how many packages you're going to get,
Oh yeah.
you might kind of go too far down a path and find that you can't really complete it. So there's a lot of just like logistics of juggling what I'm collecting and what I'm building with it to
Were
kind
you
of.
making them like in like small panels that you can then rearrange?
Yeah, well, I knew that to transport it, I'd have to put them in a van. So I
Ah,
made them in a like 4 feet by 8 foot section.
gotcha.
When I got to the gallery, I kind of stitched them all together in
Uh-huh.
place. And it's almost like when you're laying them out, you have to do it on the ground because if you do it vertically, gravity kind of stretches them out. So it's
Oh
like
yeah.
trying to take these things that are stretchable and like flexible and have them like end up in a very like precise dimension was part of the challenge.
Yeah, that's some challenge there. Wow.
Yeah, that was a doozy. But like, so I made that. I kind of like described it as a plastic tomb, kind of.
Mm,
So it had this like certain packages felt architectural and brick-like. Like enough salad containers. You can define the edges of this kind of architectural space, and it feels like masonry. And then I love the idea of these other packages that are sort of more mysterious, um, and sort of thinking about them archaeologically, like they'll probably outlive the actual product.
yep.
People discovering them like years into the future, being like, "What was this?" Like this idea of like trying to read and understand what it was, kind of like we look at hieroglyphics and like how these shapes define a language. So I was like, kind of using these forms to tell a bit of a story, like a hieroglyphic like story of this community and what our consumer habits were. So
Yeah,
I kind of framed the whole thing as a tomb. And, I love this idea of like we're burying ourselves in our own wastes.
we are.
So from there, that was like one of the last projects I did in New York. I ended up moving to Maine later that year.
Mhm.
And, you know, the goal was to keep that material out of the waste stream. So, and then I just had just enough of these sections that I was like, what am I going to do with this? Like at first I was reluctant to really butcher them and reshape them, thinking that like, I'd love to show the installation again. It took me so much time. I'd love to have it
Right.
shown at least twice. But that really never happened. I got approached by a choreographer, Lynn Newman, who has a dance company called Artichoke Dance Company, and her work is environmentally focused,
Mm.
plastic pollution largely, and
Oh, really?
she had a piece called Overflow, which was about sort of the trash that gets washed into sewers, and then at certain moments when those sewer systems get overloaded with volumes of water, they'll like shunt off sections into oceans and other waterways, and like how that's a vector for plastic trash getting into the ocean.
Mm.
So she was like, would you want to build a set for this performance? So I kind of,
How cool.
that was a fun challenge. That was like trying to take this thing that took me multiple days to install in a gallery and like reshape it into aspects that could be suspended and put up and taken down in like under 10 minutes,
Oh my gosh. Wow.
and done by and handled by other people, not me.
Oh,
And having not seen the actual like black box dance space until I got there that day. So that was like,
oh my God.
I think a lot of my work has that sort of like technical installer brain and like trying to figure out dimensions of galleries and figure out things before I actually encounter the problem.
Right. Oh, that's fun though, right? It's a fun
Yeah,
challenge.
yeah,
Yeah.
it keeps me engaged for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's kind of where that project went, and then it wasn't until in around the pandemic, 2021, I had met an artist at a residency up here in Maine, and then she was curating a show at the University of New England in Portland, kind of about um, this sort of about like speculative futurism, kind of projecting into a not necessarily what reality we will find in 200 years, but like a Maine in the future, and like what would sort of be the various focuses of the Maine community at that time. So she originally enlisted me to help her sort of build some of her work, but I think she got like a little bit overwhelmed and behind and started to invite other people into the show. And she was like, do you want to make something? And she had this greenhouse structure. And I was like, at that time, when I moved up to Maine, I had gotten a job as an organic gardener at Bowdoin College. So I started to like, I spent 3 years working in a vegetable garden and sort of like reconnected with being outside a lot and sort of like growing my own food and just sort of understanding the food system a little more clearly. And I think that's where I was like, okay, like obviously in the future, subsistence is going to be so important. So like I ended up cladding this little greenhouse in plastic that I had from that original.
Oh, okay.
And then the one that's at SVA right now is remaking that same thing, but this time I got invited to do another show later on about the food system in upstate New York for one of the upstate art weekends. And I was like, well, I can remake the greenhouse, but this time I want to do it entirely with food packaging. So I just spent some time, found a local transfer station that would let me sift through their clear plastic packaging and just found a bunch of food packages and built this greenhouse specifically out of food packaging as opposed to like, making a painting of avocado toast. I was like, I want to do something a little more critical of our food
Yeah.
system and how you can't buy greens without them being wrapped in.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
It's either that hard plastic or it's a plastic bag.
Yep.
You have to go to a farmer's market to find them without the plastic. And even then, they will try to give you a plastic bag for it.
It's stupid.
Wow. Well, that was really cool. It's one of the reasons I noticed your greenhouse is because I had previously had made a greenhouse myself, a very different greenhouse, but in a, I had this idea of trying to find a greenhouse frame that
Hmm.
I could reuse. I even considered, finding old windows for building it, but I knew that that's not a skill level that I had, so I would have had to find somebody to do it for me. And then I started a search online for greenhouses. There's like the buy nothing groups on Facebook and all of that. People are always giving stuff away for free. I'm like, oh, I got to be able to find a greenhouse. Well, guess what? I couldn't.
Oh no.
So I wound up buying one on Amazon
Mhm.
because I needed the frame. And the frame of the one that I have seen you use reminded me of that one. So I
Hmm.
was like, oh, I wonder if he got his greenhouse on Amazon as well.
That one came from another artist.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, those pieces are really quite stunning. I know of another artist who uses those blister packs, but she makes really small pieces out of blister packs, I think
Mhm.
for the most part. So it was interesting to see the difference of, it's such a ubiquitous material these days. And I've actually had people, some of my students ask me, like, what do you do with this stuff? And I've experimented with some of it myself. I've painted it, I've stitched it, um, I've drawn on it, and I sort of made it into like these little, I don't know, dioramas kind of things where everything is inside, but none of them really grabbed me. Like they're all experiments. They're in a bag under a table in my studio because they were interesting, they were cool to experiment with, but it wasn't any they never came out to be anything that I would show anywhere. Uh,
Hmm.
so to see my other friends' small creations and your gigantic installations out of those materials is really exciting.
Yeah, I feel like it transforms it enough to
Yeah.
make it feel beyond trash, I guess, right?
Oh, totally. Yeah. It's and the one that you did at Invisible Dog, you even had did you have a music or a performance inside of it or something like that?
Yeah, so it was only like a month-long show, which was kind of like it's always a little devastating when like it's not up as long as you want, it's
Yeah.
like time. So I was like, how do I bring as much to this as I can? So I collaborated with some musicians in the past. So I
Oh,
invited, and we did a concert in the space because
uh-huh.
of the idea that you could like watch a concert happening inside this structure from the outside the structure. So you're like watching the whole thing through this.
Did it obscure the sound at all?
It's hard to tell. I don't know. Uh, it was kind of noise music, so the
Oh, okay.
sound itself was pretty. Yeah, it wasn't like normal music, so it was kind of hard to tell if it was obscured by it or not. But we had like a fog machine and lasers in there and everything.
Oh, how cool.
And then we also did. There was a group called Aunts and Uncles. That was like a dance group that would do these sort of dance interventions, and they just had maybe six different performances, and some were in the space, some were around the space. So it was really cool to see people using it, I guess.
Yeah.
And then I had one moment where I had like a guy come by who's a friend who wanted to do some projection in it, which was
Oh,
super exciting. And it's like I would love to see this again. It's just never really happened, but like projecting through the structure, like the shadows you get of the light passing through that are super interesting. And then when it was like in video, it was also pretty cool because you see that shape on the surface of the plastic, but you see the sort of obscured um, projection of it on the wall behind it too. It
oh,
was, yeah,
that's interesting. Very cool. Huh.
yeah.
Wow. So I was on your website for a while, but you you use quite a lot of different materials, which is of course very, very exciting. But textile or cardboard we talked about, you
Mm-hmm.
use textile as well.
Yes, because that's
I don't
again,
know where I'm jumping, whether that's earlier work or more current work, but
they're all. I mean, I think the textile stuff. I mean, if you want to go way back, Bonnaroo, I was using yarn, and then the objects are bound in yarn. So there's
yeah.
that. There's
So
that.
there's a thread.
There's a thread there. at the Invisible Dog, I've been using those spools of elastic belts quite a bit.
Ah,
I'll jump back even further. When I was in the frame shop, one of the things we would often do was the owner would work with a print shop that was up on the third floor of the building. He would make reproductions of successful paintings by his artists, print them on canvas, and then we would stretch them and sell them as limited edition prints. And like inevitably, we would cut these little thin margins off the back to make it look nice and tidy. And we'd have these like thin strips of gessoed linen or gessoed canvas.
mhm.
And I used to roll those up, put them in frames, and kind of paint them.
Ah,
And then once I started to get access to those colorful elastic belts, I was like, I don't have to paint it anymore. It already comes with a pigment. And I started to do that same sort of densely packed rolls in these frames. But
ah.
when it came time to give something back to the Invisible Dog for what they gave to me, I created a permanent piece in their gallery where rather than kind of compressing these spools into dense shapes, kind of let them exist more spaced out and interconnected in these sort of like soft mechanical structures that,
Yeah, those looked really cool. And
yeah,
they were quite large.
I've made some big ones at this point. I've made two that are probably 30 feet long.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and it's great because I keep reusing that material, right? It's
Right.
like these sort of ephemeral installations that are up for just the run of a show. And I take all that material down and I can reuse again for a subsequent show.
I love that. Yeah.
And I've started to sort of incorporate some other materials into it. Like most recently, I kind of interwove that elastic into old slide carousels because they're also round forms like this
Uh-huh.
themselves. So it's kind of the same language, but it's disrupted a little bit by the slide carousel because one of the other materials I use a lot are 35 millimeter slides. So
Yeah,
people,
those are obsolete.
yeah, sure, but there's so many of them out there.
Yes. Uh,
Um, yeah, so the textile stuff, there's a lot of that. And I just, you get a lot of like materials that people give you are like almost abandoned craft projects, right? Which are often
oh,
text. But I've also recently connected with a company up here in Portland that does these sort of like large scale printing on textiles for wall treatments in offices and corporate spaces. And one of the people that works there is a painter who's trying to sort of give the company a greener footprint and kind of connect with the local art community and offload excess materials. Or like sometimes they'll get a big roll of a fabric and maybe it doesn't have the right like fireproofing treatment, so they
uh,
can't use it and sell it
uh-huh.
to clients, but they don't want to throw it away, so they just have like these materials that they're trying to sort of offload to people. So I've started to get a lot of material from him as
Oh,
well.
cool. Some more fiber work coming in your future.
Yeah, it's another material I end up just sort of like chewing up and trapping in these little balls.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Oh,
that's kind of like a newer direction for me is taking more of the suspended balls, which were previously installations, and kind of making them these low relief sculptures based off of like geometric drawings. So
mhm. Oh,
digging,
interesting.
digging back to my old high school math skills, I can kind of take a sort of a curvilinear drawing and then map it out and get all the coordinate points along this line. And then I create that line, but essentially just in points along it.
Yeah, that's
It's
interesting. I just thought, I wonder if so math is quilting is math as well. Are you going to be making like quilt for the wall soon? It's gonna take up some sewing?
maybe. It's funny. I worked with textile and like thread and all this stuff for so long, but I do it in a very, I guess, unskilled way, in that I don't really follow traditional ways that it's used and attached. Maybe someday I'll get there.
You never know where it will take you.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I have one more question, if you don't mind. I was really taken by your computer mice
Mm-hmm.
and how you've taken them apart and put them back together. They're adorable and strange.
It's
Can you
strange.
tell me about that series?
Yeah. So that one. it's funny because that's in some ways connected to the plastic project, and because like I said, the thread that I was stitching the plastic quilting together with was old internet cord.
Hmm.
So there was that period where I was making that, and I was like asking for plastic, but also asking for internet cord. So one of my friends from New York was working as sort of a administrative assistant in this office, and he would often empty out their supply closet of old tech. So he would send me internet cords, but he'd also send me like headphones and computer mice. So I just had a collection of maybe 30 to 40 mice that he had sent me. Um, and then it was maybe during the pandemic, uh, someone here in Maine who sort of was trying to create a performance about endangered species. So she asked me if I would make a puppet of an endangered beetle called the Puritan tiger beetle. So I made this puppet of this beetle, and I ended up using a computer mouse as sort of the main body, and then these sort of like old eyeglasses parts as the legs and stuff.
That's
And in
awesome.
my head, I was like, this is something that's like small scale, and I feel like would maybe be successful. I could sell these things as sort of
Uh-huh.
these fun objects. So I got an opportunity at a gallery up here in Maine. I was like, okay, I'm going to try to make a bunch of insects out of these computer mice. And it's kind of funny because like those mice I'd actually bound them up in a ball, and
Oh,
they were part of another installation. And I just kind of like went over to it, and I just kind of like took a pair of scissors and just kind of like harvested this ball off of this insect, cut it open, and I just took all the components out of it. And I was like, okay, here's my mice. Interesting for me to like think about the life of these objects. Like there maybe not this might not be their permanent form. They might just kind of be sequestered in this shape, and then later I can draw from them if I want to. Kind of like the idea of building things that can evolve.
hmm.
Projects like maybe they have multiple shapes or lives. So back to the mice. Yeah, I was kind of basing it off of this moment in sort of the natural history timeline called the Cambrian explosion, where like you had these environmental conditions that really just created this like really explosion in the diversity of life forms on the planet. Um, and kind of took that idea with like what's the landscape going to be, maybe post-human or just post-Anthropocene. It's just going to be texturing wasteland and being like, how is nature going to respond to that? So just kind of sort of speculative science fiction of like insect species hybridizing with old tech,
Ah,
and just started to make as many different kind of invented insects as I could with like the computer mouse as sort of the main form to it.
oh, they're really fun. Cardboard, textiles, computer parts, wires, plastic. What else? Have I missed anything?
Mm, well, the 35 millimeter slides,
Oh,
I can
yes.
tell you a little bit about that
Yeah,
project.
please.
Again, like most stories comes from like you get access to a fun cache of materials. There was a gallery I was working with, actually Recession Art. Emma Katz was the director of Recession Art, and I got an email from her like maybe in 2012. It was like, this looks like something that's right up your alley. You should look into it. And it was an old like underground culture newsletter blog kind of thing that was like advertising things happening in Brooklyn. And yeah, it was just like a call from this guy, Jason Trachtenberg, who was in a band called the Trachtenberg Family Slideshow Players.
That's a
It,
great name.
yeah, it was. I guess they found a lot of popularity in like maybe the early 2000s. It was a mom, a dad, and a teenage daughter, and their performance was they would find slideshows at like estate sales, and they would project them, and they would create songs kind of inspired by the people they were finding in these slideshows. Um, so I mean, there's like a video of them on Conan, I believe. Like, so they're like famous enough to be, invited on Conan O'Brien.
Yeah.
So I ended up go and like his thing was like, we have thousands of slides from the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. We're getting rid of them, but we want to give them to an artist. So I reached out to him, and I like went and visited him, had a cup of tea, and like ended up leaving with just like 2 IKEA bags just full of slides. Didn't really know what I was gonna do with them, but like sometimes you just come across something and you like, it's clear it has such a unique history to it, and I'm already building off of their sort of cultural imprint on the material itself. So I was just excited to have them, one at a time, just holding them up to a window. And then eventually, my mom gave me like an old little handheld slide viewer where you like slide and it would trigger battery, which would backlight the slide, and you would like look through a little magnifying lens.
Yeah, I remember having one of those.
Yeah, and I was like, well, this is, an upgrade in how I'm doing this. And eventually put 2 in the viewer at the same time. And it was like, okay, that like clicked a little bit in my head of like, there's some potential here. And then it just kind of became over time, just trial and error of overlaying 2 found slides until I get sort of like surreal compositions that are like silly and playful and like sometimes serious commentary. I don't know. There's something like really beautiful about when you find 2 random slides that just like fit together so perfectly. Like you really have to sort out based on how transparent they are, because like they need to be transparent enough that both images can kind of coexist.
Right.
It's this kind of like pure form of collage. It's like you adding 2 things in their entirety and you're getting something else out of it. And that's just really been a project I like having things that I can bounce around between. Like you can only spend so much time doing like a massive installation that takes you a year to make. Like you gotta give your brain a break. And like I find having this kind of side outlet of just looking through slides and combining them is just a different part of my brain, right? It's like there isn't math. It's just kind of culture and context.
Yeah. Oh, that's really wonderful.
And now I've probably collected like 30,000 slides, and people keep slides. I published a book in 2018 about that project, where I mean, it's kind of a unique project in that, like, as I was showing it to people in galleries, it kind of elicited this response that I don't normally get from my work, where people were like prompted to come up and tell me some story or memory that this thing reminded them of.
Oh, that's wonderful.
That's really neat. Like, how do I encourage that? And I just started to ask people who had bought them if they'd be willing to write like a unique piece of short fiction or poetry about the piece they owned, knowing that they already had some connection to it. And over like the course of 3 years, found like 29 collaborators and put it all together in this book. So presented the slide image with their written contribution.
Oh, that's lovely. That's wonderful. Yeah. Oh, I'll have to take a look at that a little more on your website.
And then I'm trying to think of what other materials might be common enough. I have a fun series with old vaccination vials.
Vaccination vials?
Yeah, this is pre-pandemic actually. Something. So when I was squatting in that old doctor's office when I was in the camp shop days, that office eventually became a veterinarian's office. So I got to know the vet that moved in, and of course, people clue in on what you're doing. And he's like, "I hate that I have to throw out these vaccine vials." He's like, "Technically, they're a biohazard. It's probably illegal to hand them out to people or whatever." But he was like, "They're not really that dangerous, and they're really cool to look at because they just have all these different colored metal caps." So, I mean, he just ended up giving me like a Santa sack full of vaccines, and I've just.
Are they glass or plastic?
They are glass. The vial part is glass, and then there's a rubber gasket, and then the caps are kind of these like squeezed metal caps on top. It makes them like impossible to recycle because it's got 3 different materials kind of bound together.
What did you do with them?
I essentially build frames as containers and then sort of make these pattern shapes where I stack the entire vial in there, and you're kind of looking at the multicolored caps and making patterns.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. Well, I can't wait to see what obscure material you pick out next.
Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much for this, Ian. This was fascinating.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's been
Yeah.
really
Well, that was an all-encompassing conversation. Thank you for being here for it. I cannot wait to experience one of Ian's installation in real life sometime in the future. That would be awesome. Thank you for listening to these episodes of Salvage. I hope you enjoy them. Please rate and review them when you get the chance. I love to get some feedback. It would be really wonderful. If you have a suggestion for an artist that I should interview, I welcome that suggestion as well. Just email me, Natalia at artbynatalia.com, or leave a message, leave a comment, or DM me on Instagram. All of those work. And if you'd like to know more about my art, check out artbynatalia.com. If you would like to learn with me, go take a look at ecoloop.art. And if you are interested in being a member of the Repurposer Collective, go to repurposercollective.com and join the waitlist. The doors are opening soon. April, Earth Month. That's right. Doors to the Repurposer Collective will open then. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time. This podcast was created, produced, and edited by me, Natalia Korover. Theme music by R.C. Gaida.